Hello students, welcome once again to this channel, Score High to Soar High. In this video, we are going to see the part 3 of the lesson, Sexual Reproduction in Flowering Plants. It is wrongly typed, make a change in it. It is not structural reproduction, but it is sexual reproduction. Okay. Don't forget to subscribe and share it with your friends and click the bell icon to get more and more videos of this kind. Now come on, let us move on to this lesson. Agents of pollination. Plants use two abiotic and one biotic agents to achieve pollination. Here the abiotic agents are water and wind. Biotic agents, animals. Abiotic agents means non-living agents. Majority of plants use biotic agents for pollination. There is a chance of loss of pollen grains in both wind and water pollination. The pollination by abiotic agents, there is a loss of pollen grains in the course of their movement. So the flowers produce enormous amount of pollen when compared to number of ovules. So in comparison with the number of ovules, generally these flowers which use abiotic agents produce large number of pollen grains, so that even if some of them get destroyed on their way, there might be some to go and reach the female part of the flower. Now, pollination by wind. Pollination by wind is more common among abiotic pollination. In wind pollinated plants, the pollen grains are light and non-sticky, so that they can be easily carried away by wind. They remain very light in weight and also they are not sticky, so that they can easily carried away by the wind current. They often possess well exposed stamens, so that the pollens are easily dispersed into the wind. Another important thing is they always possess well exposed stamens. That means what? Stamens are well exposed to the wind. They also possess large, often feathery stigma to easily trap airborne pollen grains. When it comes to the case of stigma, they are large and also they are feathery in nature, so that they can easily trap the pollen grains which come by wind. Continuation of pollination by wind. They have a single ovule in each ovary and numerous flowers packed into an inflorescence. For example, corn cob. So in these type of flowers, there is only one ovule in each ovary, and the flowers are not single flowers like hibiscus and other things. These flowers are packed into an inflorescence. Inflorescence means what? It is a botanical term in which large number of flowers cluster together to form a cluster kind of thing. That is called inflorescence. Example, they are given corn cob. The tassels that are seen are nothing but the stigma and style which wave in the wind to trap pollen grains. In the case of corn and all, we might have seen a kind of hair kind of thing, otherwise a silky thread kind of thing which remain inside the outer cover of the corns. They are nothing but the stigma and style. They look like tassels. Wind pollination is quite common in grasses. In grasses only this wind pollination is very common. Next one is pollination by water. Pollination by water is quite rare in flowering plants and is limited to about 30 genera, mostly monocotyledons. Here the pollination by water is not common, but it is very, very rare in flowering plants. So it is limited to only 30 genera, that too mostly among monocotyledons. In lower plant groups such as algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes, water is a regular mode of transport for the male gametes. In groups like algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes, water is very much essential for the transmission of male gametes. The distribution of some bryophytes and pteridophytes is limited because of the need for water for the transport of male gametes and fertilization. That's why the distribution of bryophytes and pteridophytes is limited, because unless they have sufficient water, they cannot transport their male gametes, and also for their fertilization process also water is very much essential. So they are found only where water is sufficiently present. Again, continuity of pollination by water. Examples of water pollinated plants: Vallisneria and Hydra. These two plants grow in fresh water. Next one is Zostera, otherwise seagrass. They grow in sea water. Pollination in water hyacinth and water lily. In these plants, the flowers emerge above the level of water. In these cases, the flowers emerge above the level of water. They are pollinated by insects or wind, as in most of the land plants. As in the case of terrestrial plants, most of the pollination takes place by wind and insects. Here also, in the case of water hyacinth and water lily, they are pollinated by insects or wind, not by water. This one you need to keep it in your mind. Then, pollination in Vallisneria. In Vallisneria, the female flower reaches the surface of water by the long stalk, and the male flowers or pollen grains are released onto the surface of water. In Vallisneria, the female flower reaches the surface of water by means of a long stalk, and the male flowers or pollen grains are released onto the surface of water. So what happens here? Both the female flower and the pollen grains release, both the things take place on the surface of water. They are carried passively by water currents. So the female flower and the pollen grains, they are carried passively by water currents. When they come in contact with each other, then pollination takes place. Some of them eventually reach the female flowers and the stigma. So as we have already learned that in the case of wind and water pollination, there is a loss of pollen grains. So here also it takes place. So some of them only eventually reach the female flowers and the stigma. Continuation. Pollination by water. Pollination in sea grasses. In this we are going to see how pollination takes place in sea grasses. In these plants, the female flowers remain submerged in water and the pollen grains are released inside the water. This is the difference in between water hyacinths, water lily and sea grasses. Here the plants, the female flowers remain submerged. They are underneath the water. Even the pollen grains are also released inside the water. So they have got some sort of adaptations, how the pollen grains are long, ribbon-like, and they are carried passively inside the water. In most of the water pollinated species, pollen grains are protected from wetting by a mucilaginous covering. So the pollen grain shouldn't get wet. So in order to avoid them from getting wetting, they are covered by a covering called mucilaginous. What is mucilaginous? A kind of paste kind of, in other words, a paste kind of covering. Both wind and water pollinated flowers are not very colorful and do not produce nectar, as they no need to attract insects and butterflies for pollination. Here, unlike other flowers, these wind and water pollinated flowers, they are not at all colorful. At the same time, they do not produce nectar because they are not in need of insects and butterflies for pollination, because they depend only on wind and water. Now comes the biotic agents of pollination. Bees, butterflies, flies, beetles, wasps, ants, moths, birds in the sense sunbirds and hummingbirds, then and birds, here it is wrongly typed, not ban birds, and birds are common pollinators. Bees are the dominant biotic pollinating agents. Among these biotic agents, bees take the lead. Even large animals such as some primates, lemurs, arboreal, tree-dwelling rodents. What is meant by arboreal? The animals which have trees as their habitats, they are called arboreal creatures. And even reptiles, gecko lizard and garden lizard play the role of pollinators. What is meant by gecko lizard? The lizards which are found in our households, and the garden lizards are nothing but the lizards that are found in and around our households in the gardens. They also play the role of pollinators. Insect pollinated flowers. Majority of the insect pollinated flowers are large, colorful, fragrant and rich in nectar. They are large, they are colorful, they emit fragrance and they are rich in nectar. When the flowers are small, they are clustered into an inflorescence so that they become conspicuous. Suppose when the flowers are very small in sizes, they get clustered into an inflorescence so that they become conspicuous. Conspicuous means what? Easily seen. The flowers pollinated by bees are colorful and fragrant. Then only they can attract the bees towards them. The flowers pollinated by flies and beetles emit foul odor. Generally, you might have seen the beetles and flies moving around some sort of foul smelling articles or rotten vegetables or rotten eggs like that, because they are only attracted towards bad odor. So that the flowers pollinated by flies and beetles emit foul odor, a bad smell instead of a fragrant smell. Nectar and pollen grains are the usual floral rewards. Floral rewards means what? In order to attract these insects, flowers, they should provide something so that they can attract these things. So the floral rewards are nothing but the nectar and pollen grains. So in order to take the nectar and consume pollen grains, these insects quite often visit the flowers. Insect pollinated flowers. In some species, floral rewards are in providing safe places to lay eggs. In some cases of plants, they provide safe places to lay eggs. Example, Amorphophallus, the tallest flower. In this, the flower itself is about 6 feet in height. Generally, some plants, they themselves grow up to 6 feet in height. Here, the flower itself is about 6 feet in height. So, such a tall flower it is. Another thing, there is a relationship exists between a species of moth and the plant yucca. There is a symbiotic arrangement kind of thing in between a kind of moth and the plant yucca. They cannot complete their life cycles without each other. So in order to complete their life cycles, They are badly needed of each other. The moth deposits its eggs in the locule of the ovary. What is meant by locule? A cavity, a pit kind of thing. So the moth deposits its eggs in the locule of the ovary. In turn, the plant gets pollinated by the moth. So when it comes and goes to lay eggs, the pollen grains stick on to their body parts, and that's how they pollinate. Then outbreeding devices. What is meant by outbreeding devices? The adaptations which are followed by some flowers to stop or to prevent self-pollination is called outbreeding devices. Why don't they, otherwise, why do they want to stop self-pollination? Continued self-pollination results in inbreeding depression. We all know that inbreeding always leads to unhealthy kind of offsprings. Flowering plants have developed many devices to discourage self-pollination and to encourage cross-pollination. The flowering plants have themselves adapted some methods to discourage self-pollination, at the same time to encourage cross-pollination. The first device: in some species, pollen release and stigma receptivity are not synchronized. In some species, the release of pollens and the stigma receptivity, the condition to receive the pollen grains, are not synchronized. What is meant by synchronization? Taking place in the same time. Either the pollen is released before the stigma becomes receptive. In some cases, the pollen is released before the stigma becomes ready, or the stigma becomes receptive much more before the release of pollen. In some other cases, the stigma becomes ready to receive the pollen grains much before the release of pollens. So here the things are not synchronized. It is the first device, outbreeding device. The second device, the anther and stigma are placed at different positions so that the pollen cannot come in contact with the stigma of the same flower. In some cases, they are not located at the same height. So in this case, the pollen cannot. In other words, in some flowering plants, the pollen height, the height of the anther is somewhat lower than that of the pistil. So what happens? Even though pollen grains are produced, they cannot reach the stigma. This is the second outbreeding device. The third device to prevent inbreeding is self-incompatibility. What is meant by compatibility? The condition to accept, that is called compatibility. Here, they don't have the compatibility. That's why self-incompatibility. This is the third device. In this mechanism, it prevents self-pollen, that is from the same flower or other flowers of the same plant, from fertilizing the ovules. The plants, the flowers, they themselves have developed a mechanism to stop the pollen grains from the same flower or the flowers from the same plant from fertilizing the ovules. How do they do this? This is done by inhibiting pollen germination or pollen tube growth in the pistil. Though the pollen grains from the same flower or the flowers from the same plant come and land on the stigma, these flowers, they inhibit or they stop pollen germination. They don't allow the pollens to germinate or the pollen tube to grow. In this way, they stop self-pollination. Outbreeding devices. The fourth device, The production of unisexual flowers prevents self-pollination. We have already learned that xenogamy. What is meant by xenogamy? Pollination from different plants. In the case of papaya plant, they produce unisexual flowers. That means one plant produces only staminate flowers, other plant produces only pistillate flowers. So there is no other go. The pollen grains must come from a different plant to a plant to make it get pollinated. So the production of unisexual flowers also prevents self-pollination. If both male and female flowers present on the same plant, such as castor and maize, that is monozious, it prevents autogamy but not geitonogamy. In some plants like castor and maize, both male and female flowers are present on the same plant. So in this case what happens? Autogamy is prevented but not geitonogamy. In papaya, male and female flowers are present on different plants. So that is, each plant is either male or female. In other words, each plant is either staminate or pistillate flower, that is dioicy. This dioicy condition only prevents both autogamy and geitonogamy. Then pollen-pistil interaction. The pistil has the ability to recognize the pollen whether it is of the right type, that is compatible, or of the wrong type, incompatible. So the pistil has got the capacity to recognize the pollen whether it is suitable for it or not suitable for it. If it is of the right type, that means if it is suitable, the pistil accepts the pollen and promotes post-fertilization events that leads to fertilization. If the pollen is of the wrong type, that is, if the pollen is not at all suitable, the pistil rejects the pollen by preventing pollen germination on the stigma. So, though the pollen grains come and land on the stigma doesn't, the stigma is present in the pistil, so the pistil rejects the pollen. How does it reject? By preventing pollen germination. It doesn't allow the pollens to germinate on the stigma or the pollen tube growth in the style. So, on the stigma, it prevents pollen germination. In the style, it prevents pollen tube growth. Thus, it stops self-pollination. The ability of the pistil to recognize the pollen followed by its acceptance or rejection. First, the pistil recognizes the pollen and then it decides whether to accept or reject. This is a result of a continuous dialogue between pollen grain and the pistil. Here dialogue means, it doesn't mean the dialogue, the conversation what we people have. It means an interaction. This dialogue, this interaction is mediated by chemical components of the pollen. Some sort of chemical components are secreted by the pollen grains. These chemical components only mediate this type of interaction. Pollen-pistil interaction. The pollen grain germinates on the stigma to produce a pollen tube through one of the germ spores. As we have already studied, where do germ pores exist? In the XII, in the gaps, germ pores exist. So through these germ pores, the pollen grains germinates on the stigma to produce a pollen tube. So pollen tubes are produced through one of the germ spores. Pollen tube grows through the tissues of the stigma and style and reaches the ovary. Now the pollen tube grows and it travels through the tissues of the stigma and the style, and finally it reaches the ovary. The generative cell divides and forms the two male gametes during the growth of pollen tube in the stigma. Now what happens? We have already studied the vegetative cell and the generative cell. The generative cell divides and forms two male gametes when during the growth of pollen tube in the stigma. This is called two-cell condition. In plants which shed pollen in the three-cell condition, in some plants the pollen grains are shed at the three-cell condition. There the pollen tubes carry the two male gametes from the beginning. In the case of two-cell condition, the two male gametes are formed only when the pollen tube travels through the stigma. But in the case of three-cell condition, the pollen tubes carry the two male gametes from the beginning. This condition is called three-cell condition. So with this video has come to an end. Now let us meet in the next part 4 of this video. Keep learning very well.
Like, share and comment and subscribe our channel and click the bell button for more videos. Thank you.